So more the attempts at a kind of phenomenology of being. So Joseph Campbell says the enthusiasm is originally meant having the God within, because theos is in the middle of the word. Let's look at sort of what Aristotle does with enteleko or enteleki in connection to this thought of as though I'll put it in sort of this periodicity way of stating it. In the people are more commonly talking about the Bronze Age versus Iron Age and other type of dating systems like this. But I think in the context of when we're talking about Plato and Aristotle, to me it makes more sense to talk about the classical as against the archaic. So you have the archaic Greeks, so the Greeks who still held with the archaic Greeks. So that's the interesting thing. The archaic Greeks were still there in Socrates' time and Plato's time, but they were the common people. I mean, Socrates too was one of the demes, so he was a common people as well. But he didn't have the same ideas as he was uncommon in that he was separated off by his form of enthusiasm, let's say. The common people in his time had the view of miasma, as I've often illustrated by pointing to the Battle of Arginusia, where the Athenians wanted to kill the generals for carrying out an action which brought about the victory, because they hadn't retrieved the bodies of already dead men that were washing about in the waves. But this was thought to be against the toxic waste of the miasma would be much worse, people thought, than having actually lost the battle and being enslaved by the Spartan enemy. So yeah, he has a different enthusiasm, and then through the philosophic enthusiasm we arrive at this claim that when you have something like philosophy, you then rise up out of the spēlaion, or the spelunks, the cave, in the sense of it could mean a grove, it could mean a den of as of wolves or of thieves. It could mean a tomb is used by the Septugint to mean a tomb. Also has a kind of grotto, like the Playboy grotto or something enclosed, something intimate. It can mean, it has a wide variety of applications used by the Septuagint who were aware of Plato and who had read Plato and who were philosophically minded. So it's interesting that in the New Testament we see such a wide variety of the use of the same word that Plato uses in the so-called seventh book. Plato himself, so far as I understand it, didn't enumerate his books. So this was the so-called seventh book of Plato's Politeia. At 5, there's Stephanus, line 513 or 14a, I think. So I mentioned that deliberately because just to show how much technical apparatus is literally, I mean, what is it literally? But it's like thrust on top of the original text of Plato, which didn't have any of this, this type of apparatus. But what Aristotle, so Heidegger kind of maybe he cheats in a way. He kind of treats Aristotle as the crystallization and necessary crystallization of the early Greek enthusiasm for the basically for as in the Euthyphro, in transforming the theoi into the so-called idoi, or the ideas, and then making the idea of the good the highest one. And then what Aristotle is saying with entelechy is, I mean, the word has three parts. It's like en is within, and then telos is the purpose, and then echo, or is like what is the final part of the word? It's like that. It's being done or something. I'm not sure. Actually, I'm blanking on that. But basically, he's saying, the telos is within, and it's being accomplished. It's working itself through. And then if you link that to what Aristotle says about we were talking about this, the bios Zune split last time. If you link that to his idea of the bios and the bios theoria, then it's like there's a certain way of life, which is the philosopher's way of life, and they see this theoria, or this philosophic way of life, as opposed to the archaic way, the classical way, as opposed to the archaic way. And this becomes part of their telos. But how is it understood, to be more clear, is physis is growth. So entelechy says this is why there's growth at all, why there's movement towards completion at all, is because there's this ultimate telos within. And Aristotle's showing how part of that pushing forward of things, which is the same as the tree growing or any plant growing, is facilitated, or the direction changes, as it were, so that our attitude towards moving forward is, in its efficacy and in its quality, transfigured through the theoretical gaze. So we see this. We see something that belongs to the enthusiasm of Socrates and his way of trying to get to the beings. And then we see it as changing the way everything changes. Then that becomes difficult. So it doesn't have to be. So I guess I would say Aristotle thinks this is limited to the animal. This is a change in the animal body, which is basically, then he has to come up with this theory of the angel, because he kind of wonders if this highest part of the Greeks don't think everyone really learns to think. Like they say, a lot of kids, you look at them and they can't think and they never think. But then there's many that are, when they're very young, they're already very adept at thinking and thought, and they have access to this region. And then it's this region because it's supposed to see things that don't arise in time, like a triangle, for instance. Every triangle has certain things that are thought to be the same. Is this true? And then the truth means, the aletheia here, the thing disclosed here is that according to this, we would have access through a special part of ourselves to something that has no part in the empirical, or can't decay, or didn't arise at a specific time as a sound of a car does, and then it trails off, according to the Doppler effect. There's something which supposedly, and then you get the theory of the angel based on that, because we have it somehow, maybe a part of us is always in that non-temporal dimension. And so taken that way, we see sort of how confused we are in that that we have a sort of mythos or a myth from the classical time, which means, of course, it's the classical West. And then, of course, you can see Spengler's point about the Untergang, or the downgoing, or the setting of the Western sun. It's kind of like when you see yourself that closely, and this is what the human mind is, and this is what we're using for our entelechy to guide ourselves. It sort of becomes, you sort of say, well, yeah, that's what we'd have to deal with, but maybe maybe it's not so certain what we think we know, because this is what all our thinking is based on. And then you'll diagnose specific prejudices, like materialist type of prejudices, like the Yuval Hardy, or whatever his name is, and you see, wait a second, isn't his view extremely narrow, specific kind of mythological view, but passing itself off, something connected to the Maslow's pyramid of hierarchy of needs, and some other very simple notions that simply are naive of all considerations outside that little grotto or cave. And then I guess one question I would want to ask is, since it does happen now more that we're in a world cave, and there's constant, these guys are how is his name? The guy that wrote *Sapiens*, Noah Harari, or whatever his name is. Guys like that have a lot of airplay, right? So then it's like that has a global reach. And so then we have to, I was just thinking about this problem of the cave in terms of the global media situation. So if the cave out of which the archaic rises into the classical, in the example I gave before, but out of which people that all have this type of ideas that are part of their locality, but sometimes their locality is partly corresponds to the global conversation, then are to come into contact with specific claims to rise out of the cave. One problem is, that some of the attempts to rise out of the cave, since they didn't happen spontaneously and don't have any representatives now existing in the current Dasman, or the current cave, or the current, as it were, heteronymous forces, in the sense that if we're talking about entelechy or something like that, they're sort of like they could be they could be forces dragging us down that are only in this sense of that we have this archaic belief rather than the classical belief about the issue of whether those generals ought to be executed because they failed to retrieve the bodies of the already dead soldiers in order to carry out bring the battle to success. And if they had stopped to retrieve those corpses of the already dead soldiers, they could have lost. They probably would have lost, but they wanted them to be executed because they think the fact that they couldn't bury these or burn them on funeral pyre unleashed is the miasma. So the difference in the classical and the archaic is, then I'd like it into this difference between the archaic being sort of like most people popular view, and the classical being claims to people like myself who claim to say, well, I know about the most popular vast view of the big media, but I also see it through the primary phenomenology, and then I claim to step out of the archaic into a new classical, something like that. All the enlightenments of how does this called? Dialectic of the Enlightenments, Adorno, since the time of the Cyclopses. So the quality and the efficacy that we find ourselves sort of in tuned are directed towards in our language is part of that entelechy, and then there could be a question about, well, is this totally something inside of a specific organism, so really it only affects sort of what somebody can do physically with their body, or is there a German idealism problem where we have to ask about the conditions of art Galileo art problem, I guess, that we have to ask about the primary and secondary qualities and what objectivity is, because of for instance, whether it's more objective to see things in black and white than to see things in color, or to have one kind of anatomy of the eye, a spider's eye, snake's eye, a human eye, which one is the more objective? And then a whole range of questions leading finally in the most extremely subtle forms into Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, and so on. All right, so let's leave it at that for a second.